Hello, 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 everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I am a Tolkien scholar, or at least that's what they tell me. I am here to answer your questions about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, and every week I will do a video like this where I go back and I look at all the questions that I got on Quora and pick out the best ones to sort of read out here and answer on YouTube. So, that being said, sorry about the alert sound, that just happens. With that being said, if you have a question for me, you can feel free to actually ask right in the comments if you'd wish, and I try to get to the comments as much as I can. Or, if you want to be featured in a video, or you have a really good question, or a question that you feel is too complex for just a comment section, you can go to the Quora link in the description. And that will bring you to my Quora account. If you don't have a Quora account, it is super easy to set one up. As a matter of fact, you probably already have one, since you can set it up by using your Facebook account or your Google account. That being said, we're going to start as we normally do with reading, and I'm going to be reading from the Silmarillion today. And I don't actually have it open to where I wanted to do, but I wanted to read a bit of the Second Age section. The majority of the Silmarillion, the section that's actually called Quenta Silmarillion, I just muted the music by mistake, is the majority of the book. That's the First Age. But then there are other sections about the Second Age and Third Age. So the Second Age is called a Calabeth, which refers to the downfall of Númenor. And I wanted to read that part where Númenor actually falls, because it's a pretty intense part of the Silmarillion here. Okay, it's a little bit earlier than this. Here we are. In that time the fleets of the Númenorians darkened the sea upon the west of the land, and they were like an archipelago of 1,000 isles. Their masts were as a forest upon the mountains, and their sails like a brooding cloud, and their banners were golden and black. And all things waited upon the word of Ar-Pharazôn, and Sauron withdrew into the innermost circle of the temple, and men brought him victims to be burned. Then the eagles of the lords of the west came up out of the dayfall, and they were arrayed as for battle, advancing in a line, the end of which diminished beyond sight. And as they came, their wings spread ever wider, grasping at the sky. But the west burned red behind them, and they glowed beneath, as though they were lit with a flame of great anger, so that all Númenor was illumined, as with a smouldering fire. And men looked upon the faces of their fellows, and it seemed to them that they were red with wrath. Then Ar-Pharazôn hardened his heart, and he went aboard his mighty ship, Alcaronda's Castle of the Sea. Many-oared it was, and many-masted, golden and sable, and upon it the throne of Ar-Pharazôn was set. Then he did on his panoply and his crown, and let raise his standard, and he gave the signal for the raising of the anchors, and in that hour the trumpets of Númenor outrang the thunder. Thus the fleets of the Númenorians moved against the menace of the west, and there was little wind, but they had many oars and many strong slaves to row beneath the lash. The sun went down, and there came a great silence. Darkness fell upon the land, and the sea was still, while the world waited for what should betide. Slowly the fleets passed out of sight of the watchers in the havens, and their lights faded, and night took them, and in the morning they were gone. For a wind arose in the east, and it wafted them away, and they broke the ban of the Valar, and sailed into forbidden seas, going up with war against the deathless, to wrest from them everlasting life within the circles of the world. But the fleets of Ar-Pharazôn came up out of the depths of the sea, and encompassed Avalone and all the Isle of Eressëa, and the Eldar mourned, for the light of the setting sun was cut off by the cloud of the Númenorians. And at last Ar-Pharazôn came even to Aman, the Blessed Realm, and the coasts of Valinor. And still all was silent, and doom hung by a thread. For Ar-Pharazôn wavered at the end, and almost he turned back. His heart misgave him when he looked upon the soundless shores and saw Taniquetil shining, whiter than snow, colder than death, silent, immutable, terrible as the shadow of the light of Ilúvatar. But pride was now his master, and at last he left his ship and strode upon the shore, claiming the land for his own, if none should do battle for it. And a host of the Númenóreans encamped in might about Túna, whence all the Eldar had fled. Then Manwë upon the mountain called upon Ilúvatar, and for that time the Valar laid down their government of Arda. But Ilúvatar showed forth his power, and he changed the fashion of the world, and a great chasm opened in the sea between Númenor and the Deathless Lands, and the waters flowed down into it, and the noise and the smoke of the cataracts went up into heaven. And the world was shaken, and all the fleets of the Númenóreans were drawn down into the abyss, and they were drowned and swallowed up forever. But Ar-Pharazôn the king and the mortal warriors that had set foot upon the land of Aemon were buried under falling hills. There it is said that they lie imprisoned in the caves of the Forgotten, until the last battle and the day of doom. But the land of Aemon and Erisea of the Eldar were taken away, and removed beyond the reach of men forever. And Andor, the land of gift, Númenor of the kings, Alena of the star of Eärendil was utterly destroyed, for it was nigh to the east of the great rift, and its foundations were overturned, and it fell and went down into darkness and is no more. And there is not now upon earth any place abiding where the memory of a time without evil is preserved. For Ilúvatar cast back the great seas west of Middle-earth, and the empty lands east of it, and new lands and new seas were made, and the world was diminished, for Valinor and Erisea were taken from it into the realm of hidden things. In an hour unlooked for by men this doom befell, on the 39th day since the passing of the fleets. Then suddenly fire burst from the Meneltarma, and there came a mighty wind and a tumult of the earth, and the sky reeled, and the hills slid, and Númenor went down into the sea, with all of its children, and its wives, and its maidens, and its ladies proud, and all its gardens, and its hills, and its towers, its tombs, and its riches, and its jewels, and its webs, and its things painted and carven, and its laughter, and its mirth, and its music, its wisdom, and its lore, they vanished forever. And last of all, the mounting wave, green and cold and plumed with foam, climbing over the land, overtook to its bosom Tarmiriel the queen, fairer than silver or ivory or pearls. Too late she strove to ascend the steep ways of Meneltarma to the holy place, for the waters overtook her, and her cry was lost in the roaring of the wind. And that's the end of Númenor. Okay. Well, that being said, let's get into your questions. We have, I believe, 19 questions to get into today. So let's do it. Let's see, where are we starting? I believe we're going to start over here. So this question came in from the Oski Boski, who asks, was Gothmog present in a fight against Ungoliant? Yeah, he absolutely was. He had to have been. Tolkien stated in a marginal note that there were somewhere between 3 and 7 Balrogs ever. No more than 7. If there were 3, then Durin's Bane would have been the last of them, but I believe, as many others do, that there had to have been more than 3. I don't know if there was definitely 7, but there were definitely more than 3, and it possibly could have been 7. Either way, Gothmog was their leader, or lord. Interestingly, in the early writings, Gothmog was not even a Balrog. He was the son of Melko and an ogress, but he still served as the lord of the Balrogs, because you could be the lord of something without being that something. In the published Silmarillion, all of the Balrogs are incarnated Maiar spirits. Regardless of how many there are, Gothmog is a Balrog in the current canon, and it was mentioned that Balrog still lurked under Angband and rose up and traveled to Lamath and to Melkor. So, though it wasn't explicitly stated that Gothmog was there, we understand that this is all of the Balrogs, whether it's 3 or 7 or a number in between that, and it of course would have included Gothmog. Of course, the reason that Melkor called them off was to fight off Ungoliant, who fled from their whips. Okay, next question. In The Lord of the Rings, where was Erkenbrand and the Rohirrim at? Where were Erkenbrand and the Rohirrim at during the Battle of Helm's Deep, when Gandalf found them and brought them to save King Theoden and defeat the Uruk-hai attacking Helm's Deep? Erkenbrand was actually just preparing for the battle. Erkenbrand had been fighting against Saruman's forces in the Westfold, and he sent news to Meduseld, of the death of Theodred, who is the son of King Theoden, he also requested backup, that Éomer would join him in battle, but Grima Wormtongue intercepted the message, and he made no plans to help out Erkenbrand. He made sure that nobody was coming and backing him up. Once Theodred had been killed, Saruman's forces actually did what they had set out to do, which was to kill Theodred, so they withdrew, and Erkenbrand began rallying his forces. He was moving around, gathering up as many survivors as he could, gathering arms and armor and provisions, and planning to go to Helm's Deep. So it was actually sort of Gandalf's insight that he understood, that he realized that not only was Erkenbrand alive, but he had men and arms and armor and provisions with him, and that's why Gandalf went out to gather them and bring them to Helm's Deep. Okay, next question. If Saruman encountered Sauron, would he be able to use his voice to persuade him not to kill him or harm him for his treachery and join his service again after his defeat? He could try. If he tried that, it might get Sauron laughing long enough that Saruman could make a quick exit and get out of there. Saruman's voice is something that in the circles of Tolkien discussion tends to get greatly exaggerated. People seem to think that Saruman could just use his voice to command or entice anyone or anything, even Sauron in this case. It's hilarious. It's not true, because The Lord of the Rings was pretty clear on the limits of his voice. In the chapter, The Voice of Saruman, several Rohirrim fell under his spell, but Gandalf, Theoden, Gimli, Legolas, Merry, and Pippin were unbothered by it. Later on, in The Scouring of the Shire, Saruman hints towards the rebellious hobbits that he still has access to magic, which Frodo laughs off, and he tells the hobbits the truth, that Saruman has no magic save his charisma, his voice, which is easily guarded against by being aware of it. The entire interaction between Saruman and Sauron happened because Saruman tried this trick, using his voice to convince the Dark Lord that he was joining him. Sauron saw right through it. He allowed Saruman to go on as he would trouble Sauron's enemies. Once Saruman failed at the one thing that Sauron thought he was useful for, Sauron had no use for him anymore, and nothing the wizard could say was going to help. Gandalf was right. Maybe Saruman should have opened with a joke instead. Okay, next question. Okay. This one came in from Noel, who asks, how much gold did every contributor take home in The Hobbit? If I was going to be really, really snarky and just sort of give a tongue-in-cheek answer, I would say enough. They had enough gold. Smaug slept on what was described as a mountain of treasure. There was likely a lot of other treasure under the mountain aside from what he slept on. Tolkien did not give an accounting for exactly how much this was, just that it was a lot, more than anyone could ever really need. Answers that came in on this question, like the one that preceded mine, where they try to calculate the wealth and everything, they don't hold up to scrutiny, and I don't mind calling that person out, because they didn't even write their answer, they just copied from ChatGPT. You can try, but it's a fool's errand to use math and physics to measure the worth of Sauron's treasure hoard, simply because the treasure is diverse. There's gold, of course, but it's not just gold. There's silver and there's gems. What sort of gems? All sorts of gems. The priceless Arkenstone was in there, and of course there's likely many other gems that are near to its worth, or perhaps more worth more than it. The Arkenstone was very valuable specifically to Thorin, but that didn't mean that it was the most valuable gem there. It probably was, though. And then, of course, there would have been much less valuable gems. And then, of course, there are crafts, such as the mithril coat that Thorin gave to Bilbo. And it was said by Gandalf that the mithril coat was worth more than the Shire itself and everything in it. Then there were probably glass baubles of little worth. Bilbo took home 2 chests. One was filled with gold and the other was filled with silver. It was a lot less than what he was entitled to, but more money than he could ever be expected to reasonably spend in his lifetime. He also took Helm half of the troll treasure, which he didn't even want, but Gandalf insisted on sharing it. Yeah. Esgaroth got enough to rebuild their city, but a lot of it was stolen by the Master. The elves got a share, but we don't know how much. I think Tolkien didn't want his readers to think of the value or the volume of the treasure, only to understand that it was a lot. It was more than enough to be shared, and that everyone would have more than enough. When Bilbo reasoned that the small amount that he took home was too much to spend in a lifetime, he was right. And that didn't even account for the fact that he would be the longest-lived hobbit ever. He didn't know that that was going to happen at that time. Even after he gave away the majority of his fortune to Frodo, when Frodo came of age, he still had a bag of gold to give to Samwise at the end of The Lord of the Rings as a wedding gift. And even then, he said it was almost the last drop of what he got from Smaug. So you can't really get a clear answer to how much gold, especially considering that the treasure wasn't just gold. Bilbo got a chest full of gold, but that was because he only decided to take one chest full of gold, and he also took a chest full of silver. You're supposed to sort of just use your imagination in an instance like this. Okay, next question. Who made a greater sacrifice in The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf or Saruman? Why? Gandalf made sacrifices. Saruman suffered losses. There's a big difference here. Saruman, at no point does he really make a sacrifice. There was one person in the discussion here that said, well, maybe he sacrificed his integrity. But I think that that's not what Tolkien would define as a sacrifice, although it is a clever way of putting it. But Saruman didn't make sacrifices, he just lost. He suffered defeats. He had his power stripped from him, and he was eventually deposed and then murdered. And he was denied passage back to the west. Everything that happened to Saruman was direct consequence of his actions and his choices, and none of his actions or choices were to sacrifice, but to try and gain power. Gandalf, on the other hand, sacrificed not only his life to defeat the Balrog, but in his mind, he may have been sacrificing the quest itself. Gandalf did not know that he was going to be resurrected. So in dying, he was leaving Frodo without his guide, putting it all in the hands of Aragorn. This is not even the first time that Gandalf was willing to sacrifice his life either. In The Hobbit, he was ready to take himself out in a magical explosion, killing as many orcs as he could on his way out. The arrival of the Eagles of Manwë meant that he did not have to. Okay, good question though. Next question, this one, let's see. What caused Frodo's change in mental state at the end of his journey in The Lord of the Rings? The One Ring caused it, though there is a reason that it got a lot worse at the end. Frodo's mental state, not to mention his physical state, deteriorated hard toward the end of his journey, and afterwards, though there would be improvements, he still had some fairly major issues. Carrying the One Ring for a length of time, which carries with it the majority of Sauron's power, was going to be taxing to anybody. Bilbo was partially corrupted, Gollum was transformed and made even more wretched than he already was, Isildur found it physically painful to even touch the ring. Frodo did not carry it the longest, Gollum did, but he carried it into Mordor with the intent of destroying it. The One Ring has its own will, and it does not wish to be destroyed, so it fought back hard against Isildur and Frodo, who both wished to destroy it and tried to get away from Bilbo and Gollum, who wished to just keep it. It wanted to be with Sauron. The One Ring also gets more powerful the closer it is to Samath Naur, and Frodo reached the end of his endurance. He needed Sam to carry him, and then when Sam couldn't carry him anymore, Frodo had to crawl. The sad thing is, Frodo didn't even really get the chance to destroy the ring. He succumbed to it instead, and then it was ripped from him, or bit off of him, more accurately, by Gollum. Just as Gollum losing the ring in this sense damaged his mind, the same happened to Frodo. Bilbo got off easy. He managed to give it away willingly, as did Sam when he had it very briefly. The same happened to Frodo, though, that happened to Gollum. Bilbo had a lot of help. He had Gandalf with him, and Gandalf noted that he could have forced Bilbo to give up the ring, but that it would have broken his mind, and that that whole idea of his mind being broken, that's what essentially happened to Frodo. So Frodo was left in a state where he'd always feel a little bit sick because he had been succumbed to Shelob's venom. He always had pain in his shoulder from the Witch King's Morgul blade, and worst of all, he would always feel the mental and spiritual pain of the loss of the precious. Arwen's gem helped him a bit, but he still suffered. This is why he had to sail to the west to be fully healed, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. All right, next question. Were there any other wizards in Tolkien's Legendarium who came to Middle-earth before The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings series, similar to Saruman and Gandalf? There were at least 3 others, aside from Gandalf and Saruman. There was, of course, Radagast the Brown. He was mentioned by Gandalf in The Hobbit, who called him his cousin, and he had a scene in The Lord of the Rings where he met Gandalf outside the entrance to the Shire and told him that Saruman needed him in Isengard immediately. There were also Merenatar and Ramastano, the blue wizards, who arrived even earlier and traveled to the lands to the east and to the west. To the east and the south, rather. To the east and to the south of Middle-earth. Saruman also traveled to these regions, the east and the south, but then he returned to the northwest, the Europe portion of Middle-earth. In one version of the story, these 5 wizards were called the chiefs of the wizards, suggesting that there were other lesser wizards that were never named. Now, whether or not that's true is sort of up for debate. It's a matter of conjecture, because there are multiple versions of the story of the arrival of the wizards, but Saruman mentions in The Lord of the Rings the rods of the 5 wizards, suggesting that there were either indeed only 5, or that only 5 of them carried staves. So, essentially, yes, there were other wizards that arrived earlier, like Gandalf and Saruman, but not Gandalf and Saruman. There may have been more. They had also come to Middle-earth one time in the very, very, very distant past. When the elves were first awakening and they were migrating the elves from their point of origin to the Undying Lands, there were 5 guardians, which were the same 5 spirits that became the wizards later, and they were led by Melian. So, in a way, Melian is sort of the head of that order, although she seemed to have stepped down after that whole thing, because she stayed in Middle-earth. While they went home, she stayed. She fell in love with an elf named Ilúthingol. So, there you have it. Okay. All right, let's move on to the next one. Was the movie The Lord of the Rings made as a whole and then later released as 3 separate movies? Not exactly. The Lord of the Rings was always intended to be multiple films, not one film. Jackson initially envisioned it actually as 2 films. There would still be a trilogy. The first film would be The Hobbit, and then the other 2 films would be The Lord of the Rings, sort of like a part 1 and part 2. But he later found out that he did not actually have the rights to The Hobbit at the time, so that would have to come later. At this point, buried sneakily at the start of this second paragraph, I have to bring up something that I talked about last week, is that there is a page on Facebook that has been stealing my content. So I want to let you guys know that if you're ever on Facebook and you see a post that sounds suspiciously like something I wrote, please report it. Okay? And it's always whenever I make an answer where I use a picture from the movie, or if I'm talking about the movies, those tend to wind up on Facebook. So if you ever happen to see that, report it, and also let me know if you can. I've just been stealthily putting that in there, and I just remembered about it because this is a movie question. But anyway, so he had always planned to do 3 films, but it was originally going to be Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Rings. Jackson shopped around the idea of doing a duology, 2 films, Lord of the Rings Part 1, Lord of the Rings Part 2, and he actually met strong resistance. Movie studios were interested in 1 film, not 2, at least until he came across New Line Cinema, who said, well, why not 3? It was published across 3 books, we should do a trilogy. As The Lord of the Rings was published across 3 volumes, this actually made perfect sense. So while all 3 films were filmed during the same period, this was not because it was 1 film that was later broken into 3, but it's a cost-saving and time-saving measure. For example, The Shire is filmed in The Fellowship of the Ring as well as in The Return of the King. It makes the most sense to film all the scenes that take place in the Shire back to back to back and then move on to the next location. And that's usually the way movies are made. So if you're making 3 movies, it saves time, it saves money to sort of do it in that fashion. But Peter Jackson was well aware that it was going to be 3 films. Okay, next question. This one came in from Mark Hard, who asks, when Gandalf died in Moria and had his spirit rehoused as Gandalf the White, how does he regain his elf ring? So I get this a lot. A lot of people make an assumption that Gandalf was rehoused, meaning he got a new body. And that's not actually the case. He wasn't rehoused. He was returned to the same body that had already died. Gandalf didn't get a new body. And that's why he had the ring, as well as his sword. That's the hint that it was not a new body. A bit after the reveal of his resurrection, we get an account of what actually happened, that Gandalf came back to life, but he was not conscious or able to move for quite some time. He was healing. Just when he was starting to stir, Gwaihir came and scooped him up and brought him to Lothlorien, where Galadriel gave him white robes and a new staff. He was still wearing his Ring of Power, and he must have died clutching his sword, which makes perfect sense since he died fighting the Balrog, so he still had the sword as well. Okay, next question. Oh wow, this is a doozy of a question. Why all that is gold does not glitter? Not something of the meaning, not all that glitters is gold. This sounds stupid, but when you consider the metaphysical role of gold, tainted, and the stars also glitter, the second sentence would make more sense in my opinion, as in not all that power is corrupted. There are still stars, there is still hope. There can be a king who would be good. I know the original phrase is old, but I wonder why did Tolkien change it like that and not in a way that would fit his cosmology better? If I lived in Middle-earth, I'd understand not all gold does glitter as a warning against hidden evil, or maybe I'm reading that wrong. Okay, so I'm going to be really honest with you here. It's hard to tell what you're actually saying. I think you are indeed reading it wrong, though. I'm going to try and explain this as best I can. The phrase, all that is gold does not glitter, that's the actual phrase, it fits perfectly to the story, the cosmology, and the situation at hand, which is Strider. Strider is gold, in the sense that he is a good person, he is a noble king to be, who was the hobbits' best bet of making their way to Rivendell. He does not glitter, meaning that he does not appear to be what he truly is. He does not look great and noble. He looks dirty and disheveled. Frodo reads the letter from Gandalf, which has a part of this poem in it, including this line, with a warning to make sure that he found the real Strider and not an imposter. The real one's name is Aragorn and carries a broken sword. Frodo states that he already had felt in his heart that Strider was a friend and not an agent of the enemy, Sauron, because an imposter would have been, in Frodo's own words, fairer and fouler, meaning that he would have gone through great lengths to appear good, but he would feel foul, while Strider looks like a homo, but he feels like a friend. The meaning here is that just because something is not pleasing to the eye does not mean that it is not good. Bilbo angrily recounts the same lines to Boromir later in the story, when Boromir scoffs at the idea that this Strider could be a man of Gondor, much less their king. Boromir has chosen to judge Aragorn by his appearance. He does not glitter, so he must not be gold. This is unwise, as pointed out by Bilbo. Okay, next question. If Sauron had reclaimed the One Ring and defeated Gondor, would he have hunted down Radagast the Brown and killed him, or asked him to join him and replace Saruman and placed him in control of Mirkwood Forest and the Northern Kingdoms? That's an interesting question, and I think there's sort of like a different question that's buried in there. I think the question that's buried in there would be, does Sauron even know who Radagast is? There is no question that he knew of Saruman. They had communicated, and before this, he knew of Gandalf, who was part of the group that drove him out of Mirkwood. Gandalf had been there twice before that. Once he came openly and Sauron fled, and the second time Gandalf came secretly and Sauron was not aware of him. But he would, at that point, know of Gandalf? We don't know a lot about Radagast, and we don't know if he was on the Dark Lord's radar. The same, of course, could be said for the Blue Wizards embedded in his own lands, fostering rebellions among his people. Radagast sort of vanished around that time that Frodo was staying in Rivendell. He could not be found. So it seems that Radagast took himself out of the story before its conclusion. If Sauron had won, what becomes of Radagast? I think that Sauron would accept no less than total and complete devotion. He would not attempt to recruit an agent of the Valar unless they came to him, and even if they did, which Saruman did, he would see through any deception. Sauron was aware that Saruman wasn't telling the truth. He could just tell that he could use the wizard. So if he already won, he would not have much use for Radagast unless the wizard devoted himself to Sauron fully, which he would not. So to answer the question as it was written, if indeed Sauron was aware of Radagast, and in the event of his victory, I believe Radagast would be in grave danger if he ever showed his face again. Okay, next question. All right, this one came in from Space Monkey. There's a bunch of numbers, but I'm not reading all the numbers. I'm kind of confused as to why the Men of Númenor lived so long. Was it because of the blessing they received from the Valar, or was it because their first king Elros was half-elf? It was both, actually. The blessing of the Valar made the Dunedain, which are the men of Westerness, the Númenorians, have a much longer lifespan than regular men, but the average Dunedain would not live to be 500 years old like Elros did. In the story, Eldarion and Arendis, the Mariner's wife, which is in Unfinished Tales, it is mentioned that Tar Eldarion is of the line of Elros and was pressured to find a wife that was also of Elros's line, for they lived longer than those in Númenor who were not. He married Arendis, and she was not of Elros's line, so she aged faster than him. Their marriage was not great. The difference in lifespan was part of it, but also he really didn't seem all that interested in marriage. She had fallen in love with her, but he didn't really fall in love with her. He fell in love with the sea and exploration, and most particularly Middle-earth, and he loved sailing to Middle-earth. Their marriage fell apart over time because Arendis felt more and more disconnected from her husband, who no longer matched her in age, and he didn't seem all that interested in spending a whole lot of time with her, and was already off spending years away from home gallivanting in Middle-earth. And years apart for a couple, it hits a lot worse to a woman who doesn't have as long to live as her husband does. So, that sort of shows you that there's sort of two classes of lifespan in Númenor. There's those of Elros's line and those not of Elros's line. The ones that are not of Elros's line, they still live much longer than average men. They live longer than men of Middle-earth, but not as long. So the Valar blessed the Dunedain. Those specifically descended from Elros, they lived even longer. Eventually, both of these lines diminished greatly. They were no longer living to be 400 or even 300 years of age. For example, Aragorn was 210 years old when he died, and Faramir lived to be 120. Okay, next question. All right, this one came in from Matt Wren. When Galadriel evaporates that giant orc who's about to harm Gandalf in the third Hobbit movie, is this an accurate representation of her true powers? No, not really. Firstly, I should mention that Tolkien never concerned himself with things like power levels and scaling and all the nonsense that comes with it. Secondly, it should be mentioned that Tolkien saw a distinct difference between power and might. The example seen in the Hobbit film trilogy is might, where Galadriel can do these great feats of war using her innate magic. In the book, The Lord of the Rings, because she's not a character from the Hobbit, we get a very different view of Galadriel that falls more in line with the power side of things, not might. Though there's some caveats here. To illustrate my point, Sam asked her if he could see some elf magic, and Galadriel seems genuinely confused. She says she doesn't really know what elf magic is, but upon demonstrating the mirror basin, she asks Sam if he's satisfied, which he is, though Sam was also upset at what he saw in the mirror, so that wasn't a great experience for him. Galadriel is not meant to be seen as fearsome. Even the film version of The Fellowship of the Ring got this wrong. Peter Jackson's Galadriel puts on quite the fright show. She demonstrates the director's past as a horror director, she even seems disoriented and exhausted afterwards, almost as if she had been possessed in that scene where she's, not only is she like yelling, but she's got this demonic voice. And then if you look at Ralph Bakshi's version from the 1978 animated The Lord of the Rings, you get something more in line with the book, where it's different. Jackson's film is superior in most aspects, but this is the one comparison where Ralph Bakshi's film was better. Galadriel doesn't yell in his version. The color palette doesn't shift. But rather she's giving us a lament, and it's tinged with unease, the slightest bit of menace. Galadriel doesn't need to speak in an unearthly voice to put Frodo and Sam on edge. That is not to say that Galadriel is bereft of might. She's not helpless. She could easily kill an orc, but she would do it with a weapon, not vaporizing it with magic. But the power of Galadriel was subtle and mysterious. Next question. Let's see. What if a Sindar married one of the Avari? Would their descendants be considered Sindar? The difference in the type of elves is cultural more than anything. Though there were Calaquendi and Moraquendi, meaning light elves and dark elves, this was based on who had seen the light of the two trees and who had not. The Sindar were gray elves, and they were technically Moraquendi, or as they prefer to be called, they didn't like the term Moraquendi, but Umanyar, which means not of Aman. Though there was one exception, Ilúthingol, their king, he had seen Valinor and he had seen the two trees, so technically he was Amanyar, or of Aman, but he didn't live there. He came back to Middle-earth and he stayed in Middle-earth. He was a Sindar. The Avari were the unwilling. They did not start the great journey. They did not follow Aroma to the west, while the Sindar started the journey, but they didn't finish it. They stopped at some point. Now, you don't hear much of the Avari beyond the initial journey, as elves born after the first Great Migration would not have that choice. So they would they be considered Avari at all? Not really, because it's a cultural thing. Avari is a specific term for elves that ignored the summons of the Valar. Sindar is a term for a specific culture of elves that lived under Ilúthingol and his descendants. In the Third Age, there weren't even that many Sindar left. Thranduil and Legolas were Sindar, but they reigned a group that was mostly Sylvan elves, which are the wood elves. The same could be said of Celeborn, though some versions of the story, he's not a Sindar, he's a Falmar. These delineations, they're not racial, they're cultural. Galadriel, for example, has a Noldor father and a Falmari mother. She is not half and half, she's considered a Noldo, because that's how she was raised and that's her culture. So it would really depend on how the child is raised. The Avari became many smaller tribes, so the child could be considered to be in one of those tribes, or they could be considered to be Sinda, if that's the way that they were raised and the culture that they chose to live under. Okay, next question. In The Lord of the Rings, what happens to Treebeard and the Ents during the Fourth Age? There's not a lot of information on this, but I can tell you what we do know. Isengard, and more specifically the area that directly surrounds Orthanc, was restored to its former glory, and it became known as the Treegarth of Orthanc. The Treebeard stayed there for a time, and Aragorn, the king, declared it to be a self-governing free land of the Ents. So basically, while the tower and everything in it belonged to Aragorn, the surrounding forest was an Entish realm. Beyond this, we really don't know. The only hints that are given in the text would be the discussion between Treebeard, Galadriel, and Celeborn. Treebeard asks when he will see them again, and Celeborn says he does not know, while Galadriel, who is planning on sailing to the west, tells Treebeard that she will not see him again until the world is remade and they will meet in a restored Beleriand. This suggests that the Ents will survive deep into the future and be able to go back to their point of origin. Okay, next question. Would the Nazgûl have actually taken the One Ring back to Sauron? Yes, they absolutely. They really had no choice in the matter. The Nazgûl have no will of their own. They're fully slaves in both body and spirit to Sauron, due to the fact that they were permanently bound to the Nine, and the Nine were permanently bound to the One. This means that they were the most fully trusted of Sauron's minions. They could not betray him. They were physically, mentally, and spiritually incapable of doing so. It is possible that after the destruction of the One Ring, they could have been freed from this had they survived. But they didn't, because they were mortal men and they were only anchored to the world by the power of Sauron's necromancy. They stood no chance. They were immediately subject to the gift of man. Even the Witch King, who was the greatest and afforded the most independence and the most demonic power, was still nothing more than Sauron's thrall, and would deliver the One as well as anyone who carried it to his master. To put it simply, Nazgûl means ring wraith, meaning wraiths created by the magic of rings, and Sauron is the Lord of the Rings. They could not keep the One from him. It would have been impossible. Okay, next question. This is a quick one. If you could live anywhere in Tolkien's Middle-earth, where would it be? I would live in Mithlond, in Lindon. Mithlond means Grey Havens. Lindon is probably the safest place in Middle-earth, and I would get to be by the sea and the mountains. I would be surrounded by elves, most particularly Círdan, the oldest known elf in Middle-earth. Can you imagine the stories that he tells? Many elves would come through Lindon to board the ships at Mithlond and sail to the west, which would be fascinating to watch. And if I ever needed a change of company, the Shire is just to the east, and the Blue Mountains, where there are dwarves, is just to the north. So it's sort of like a great spot, I think. Okay, next question. What makes the character of Túrin controversial among fans of J.R.R. Tolkien? As far as he is controversial, I would say it's the fact that he's a jerk. Túrin Turambar is by far the most flawed of Tolkien's heroes, and I'm not even counting the fact that he married his sister. He didn't recognize her as his sister. He had not seen his sister in a really long time, so he was thinking of his sister as a little girl, not an adult woman. And she, for her part, had lost her memory. One might have a great deal of sympathy for Túrin Turambar and all of the trauma he goes through, but in reading the story The Children of Húrin, it's hard to escape the fact that so much of Túrin's misery was self-inflicted by a series of bad decisions, pride and arrogance, impatience and rashness. Túrin killed a lot, and some of it was accidental. He did not mean to slay the elf Saros. That elf brought on his own demise. Túrin only meant to beat him up a little, and that was well deserved. And the slaying of Beleg was also an unfortunate accident. So it was so sad that even Túrin's sword mourned the event. However, he hung out with a gang of murderers and rapists, and while he did not tolerate the latter, he certainly engaged in the former. Túrin and his men needlessly and wantonly slew Kim, and prevented his father Mim from saving his son, and had very little mercy on the grieving father, who did nothing to provoke such an attack, ransoming his life and occupying his home at sword point. People who think of Mim as being in the wrong for betraying Túrin sort of fascinate me. I came across one person who said that Mim was petty for attempting to avenge his son. And no, it wasn't referring to Mim as a petty dwarf, because it's literally what he is. They were saying that his actions were petty. The worst part of it, to me, is that Húrin later killed Mim because he believed him to be just a traitor who attacked his son. He didn't know the evil things that his son did, because Morgoth was only showing him the bad things that happened to his son, and not how his son made those things happen. Even in the events that were an accident, such as Saros falling off that cliff, Túrin just assumed that he would be unjustly blamed and exiled, and he stormed off in a rage, leaving Doriath before the king had even heard of this event. Thingol, who you heard the story, he rightfully blamed Saros and thought that Túrin was blameless, and he lamented that he had left and had no plans on punishing him at all. But Túrin had it in his head that he would be exiled, so he made it happen. This is the fascination of Morgoth's curse that so much of it is self-inflicted. It's sort of like the concept of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Túrin is the protagonist of his story, but he's hardly the heroic ideal, which is what makes the story so fascinating. He's not a great noble man like Aragorn or Beren or Tur. He's a jerk, and he just happened to be on the right side of the war, so there you have it. Okay. Wow, we got through these. We got through these at a pretty good pace, huh? Because there's only one left. There's only one left. So let's get on to that last question, and that is, why does Gollum hate the sun and the moon? Because in embracing evil, light became anathema to him. Creatures like orcs and trolls also have issues with the sun, which was created after their inception. They were born in the darkness. Trolls are outright killed by direct sunlight, while orcs just find it painful. The sun and the moon are not celestial bodies in Tolkien's work. They're the last fruit and the last flower of the two trees of Valinor, put into containers by Aule, hallowed by Varda, and born through the sky by the Maiar spirits Aryan and Tilion. To put it simply, the sun and the moon are holy, and they burn evil. The moon, though, it gives off significantly less light. And while Gollum certainly doesn't like it, he can tolerate it. The sun, born by Aryan, is much brighter. Even Aryan herself was said to be hard to look at. She was beautiful, but she was so radiant that you had to squint. Much like the elvish bread, the lembas tasted like ashes and dust in Gollum's mouth, and elvish rope burned and froze his skin. The light of the sun was painful to him. This does not mean that darkness is in itself evil. Many elves preferred nighttime and the dim light of the stars. They were born after the breaking of the lamps and far away from the two trees of Valinor. They lived in perpetual night by the stars. Creatures that are evil, however, always detest the light. Even Melkor, who was drawn to the light, also hated it, and he cast it down whenever he could. Okay, guys, so if you got all the way through this, you must have liked the video. So how about giving me a like? How about subscribing if you haven't already, and sharing the channel around? We have been growing, and been giving you guys the progress here. We're at currently 456 subscribers, which is fantastic. And according to my YouTube analytics, which I have right here, that means we have gotten 106 subscribers in the last 28 days. Views are up, watch time is up. We're making progress here, but we've got to keep on grinding and keep on bringing in new people so we can sort of level up the channel. YouTube doesn't really work the way that it used to, where you just would one day be offered a partnership. You have to sort of go through all these different tiers and everything, and the first tier that we can achieve is close, because all we need is 500 subscribers. So like I said, if you haven't subscribed, please do so, and share this channel or this video with some friends who might enjoy it. We'll see you guys next time.